Good morning. It's the second Sunday after Christmas. Merry Christmas and Happy New Year. We're going to look at a lectionary text for the new year, and it's in Ecclesiastes chapter 3. Now, I know when I say Ecclesiastes, typically there are one of two responses. Some folks avoid this book like the plague, find it confusing, overwhelming, pessimistic, cynical, not helpful. Other people have found Ecclesiastes to be a book that helped them come to faith or belief in God, or even more so, a book that helped people keep the faith or keep connection with a God who is over or superintending or providential in the affairs of this crazy world. Which person do you find yourself to be? Avoiding the book of Ecclesiastes because it's so confusing? Or really drawn and attracted to it because it helps explain the confusion? We wouldn't call Ecclesiastes philosophical. We would call it wisdom literature. The Hebrew people, they don't have philosophy or philosophers. What they have is wisdom, people who are wise in life, wise in living, wise in practice. And so we are gifted wisdom literature through that people, through that culture. Would you turn there, Ecclesiastes 3? In 1959, I think 1959, Pete Seeger, he was an organizer and a musician, played folk music, wrote folk songs. He wrote a song based upon, you might be familiar with it because the band The Byrds, Byrds, made a pop rock song out of it, and it was more popular on the radio. To every season, turn, turn, turn. There is a reason, turn, turn, turn. And a time to every purpose under heaven. And then it jumps in, a time to be born and a time to die, and on and on. Well, if you've turned there, if you've found that small book back in your Old Testament, I want to read through and talk through the first 15 verses. Okay? Here we go. There is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. Now, we need to know that these things we're going to look at, these pairs, that just sort of round out the experience of life. Most of these things aren't things that we choose. Rather, they're imposed upon us, and we just have the opportunity to respond or to react. For instance, you don't choose to weep. Rather, something happens, and our response is to weep. In the same way, you don't choose to be born, and you don't choose to die. It's things that are imposed on us in this life. The teacher who writes, there is an appointed time for everything, and there is a time for every event under heaven. In Hebrew, the name teacher is Kohelet. So Kohelet is giving us some wisdom about the seasons and the activities of life, and starting with the understanding that they are basically imposed on us. Verse 2, a time to give birth and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to mourn and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to shun embracing. We should be shunning embracing right now. A time to search and a time to give up as lost. A time to keep and a time to throw away. A time to tear apart and a time to sew together. A time to be silent and a time to speak. A time to love and a time to hate. A time for war and a time for peace. Verse 9, what profit is there to the worker from that in which he toils? Kohelet, or the teacher, is not saying that all these things are that we should or shouldn't be doing these types of activities. He's saying that we do. That if you look around, these are the things, and it's a beautiful text, and it's poetry, and you can sit with it and contemplate it. I mean, this is the time to meditate or chew on the scriptures, to see what does the Lord have for us in recognizing that the world turns. And unfortunately, we don't have a lot of control about that. It turns, and we have to respond, and these things happen. Whether they're good or bad, these things happen. And he returns, Kohelet, the teacher, in verse 9, returns to a question that he's often asking. What profit or what gain is there in anything that we do? Anything that we do ends up turning to dust. You've often heard me say that the moment a building that we build new, a house, church, building, doesn't matter, hospital, the moment that we finish that build, that project, is the moment that building begins to fall apart. The moment we put new sidewalk down and finish it is the moment that it begins to break apart because of the elements, right? The things that we do, and even ourselves, from dust we came, and dust we are returning. So what value is there even in living, he asks? What value is there in everything that I do? Someone else will come later and either undo it, or take it, or do it better. Everything that I have is temporary. Where is this meaning? It appears as if everything is meaningless. And so Kohelet, the teacher, says, what meaning is there in all of this? Verse 10, I have seen the task which God has given the sons of men with which to occupy themselves. He has made everything appropriate or beautiful in its time. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Pause there for a moment. Let's zero in verse 11. He has made everything appropriate in his time. When Kohelet, the teacher, asks the question, where is the meaning if it all goes away? Where is the meaning if nothing lasts? Where is the meaning if one season changes into another? He's always asking that question, or most of the time, in a space that is without the supervision or the superintendence or the providence or the care of God. And in verse 11, he introduces that all of those things are happening under the care of God. Now, you say, well, what about killing and war and maybe some of the other things, the hate that are listed? And we're going to talk theologically. The Lord permits it. He permits what's going on. Apparently, what he's doing is greater than the loss and the meaninglessness and the suffering now. But in our Bible, we never intellectually, and possibly not in our hearts, maybe not, we never resolve that tension that God is overseeing things and yet permits these things to happen. And then we get to discussions of free will and predestination, which may not even be valuable. The teacher says, let's just work with what is. Quit with the oughts and the shoulds. Let's work with what is. And he introduces the idea that in those times, isn't it possible that God superintending them or caring or even just noticing those seasons that he listed, good, bad, indifferent, isn't it possible that God noticing those or being with them or over them, some people use the word sovereign, isn't it possible that that is what provides the meaning? God going through them. God with you. God living next door. God becoming human forever in a resurrected body. Isn't possibly that satisfy what we're looking for when we say everything turns to dust and everything is meaninglessness? Could it be that God with us satisfies some of that ache, some of that meaninglessness, some of that vanity? So God is noticing, but then look in the second part of verse 11. Remember, the Hebrews teach us wisdom, and it is wisdom to know which time is which. That we just read, those seasons, those movements of life. Wisdom is knowing what time you're in, right? I mean, that's the point of it. For you to form and develop, to understand the ways of God and the ways of the world that he created, even in its broken form, and to understand what time you're in. And here, you're going to say, Josh, is this hopeful? And I'm going to tell you, yes, it satisfies. To name this and normalize it satisfies the soul. Here we go. He has also set eternity in their heart, yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done from the beginning even to the end. Here's what the teacher is saying. God has placed inside people, human beings, men and women, God has placed inside them, us, some feeling that this is not right. And I can conceptualize and hope and look for something better. I see a situation. I'm in a situation and I don't want it to be this way. And I want to be able to work it out, and yet I feel powerless to do that. Or I look at the world and I say, there is something here that could really work, but we're powerless to make it work. He says, we have eternity, or the concepts of eternity, of perfection, of wholeness, of fullness, of completeness. We have those concepts about our family, about work, about nations, about people groups, about our neighbor. We have concepts about our children of how it should go, and yet it doesn't end up going that way. And you say, how's that hope? How's that hope? Well, here's what the wisdom of the Hebrew people would say. Here's what our Hebrew school teachers would say. It's like, let's just use numbers 1 through 10. It's like God has placed in you the ability to dream of and hope for a world that is 10 out of 10, full, 100%. Everything works, nothing's broken. You have this longing for it. And that's the eternity in your heart, as it says. You can see or want 10 out of 10. You're not satisfied. Being not satisfied is one half click from hope. I know that sounds backward, but it is the wisdom that we have received. So you have the capacity to dream of a 10 out of 10. And we are gifted with actually, if we want to, we can tell the truth. And we can look at our position and say, man, I'm only living about a 3 out of 10. Or my community is only living at a 4 out of 10. Or our world or our country is only living at a 2 out of 10. 5 out of 10, whatever. We can diagnose where we are. If we want to tell the truth, we can. And then the third component to this is we can measure the distance between where we are, if we tell the truth, and where we need to be, and say, I'm at 3, and I can conceptualize 10, and then I can measure the distance between 3 and 10, and it's 7. And I need to go 7 steps or 7 clicks to get to eternity. And yet I am powerless to do it. Powerless. We can see eternity. We can see perfection. We can conceptualize it. We can hope for it and long for it and feel a vague meaning about it. We can diagnose our problems and diagnose our situation. Then we can measure the distance between what should be and what is. And then we are powerless to make up the distance. We cannot traverse the distance. That is our human predicament. And if we recognize that, though that is the seed or the beginning of hope, and only from that can joy come. Only from the longing for what is to come or what should be, and recognizing where we are and giving up on the project of making yourself better. Give up on the projects of making yourself better. Rather, endure the seasons and the times. Recognize which times and seasons you are in, or we are in, and understand that there is God with you in all of that. And if there wasn't, then we have dust to dust. But with God, we have dust to new bodies. The only way to hope and joy. In fact, some writers would say, some authors, faithful people, would say that the feeling of joy is actually that longing or that recognition of the distance that we need to traverse and wanting it. And that's actually the feeling of joy. I know that's mystical. I know that you'll have to get into your hearts and stir around in your inner being to make that leap or to understand that. Don't be afraid to mess around in your hearts. Verse 12. I know that there is nothing better for them than to rejoice and do good in one's lifetime. Moreover, that every man who eats and drinks sees good in all his labor. It is the gift from God. While you may say, Josh, your version of hope and joy seems a little lacking, I want to remind you that the scripture says, and this is about the only time you're going to hear Pastor Josh use the word happy. Living into the seasons and are enjoying labor, creating enjoyment, enduring what is seemed as meaninglessness, enduring that with the idea that there are graces sprinkled through life that you can latch onto, that you can look for, that you can dig for, and that you can celebrate. And seeking out and finding those graces in the midst of what looks like ashes and dust is a gift from God. And you can find pleasure and contentment and happiness in that. Eating and drinking and doing the cycles, doing the seasons, and looking for the little graces, knowing that God is superintending the world. You may disagree with him on how he does it, but he's there. Knowing that it is a gift from God. 14, I know that everything God does will remain forever, in contrast to a lot of what we do. There is nothing to add to it, and there is nothing to take from it. For God has so worked that men should revere, respect, hold him in awe. That which has already been and that which will be has already been. For God seeks or pursues or makes quickly happen what passes by. Poetic way of saying, but God is not distant. In fact, his hands are thoroughly involved. And we see that pattern and we see that type. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. There's nothing that is created that he did not create. Everything that is created by him. And the Word moved in to our neighborhood. The Word became flesh. This is the pattern that is hoped for in this text that we see fulfilled in the beginning of the life with Jesus. And so I'm going to take a quick left turn here. There's something that I want to address practically from this message. And that is the issue of personal holiness. Yes, how we live, what we do, the choices that we make. We want to do good, we want to do right. But in some of our Christian circles, the only thing that we interpret as faithfulness is being consumed with personal holiness. And I want to tell you that being consumed with personal holiness, making yourself better, making yourself successful, making yourself good enough, making yourself good, it is a project that does not depend on the providence or the grace of God. That project doesn't depend on his work in your life. That project only depends on you. And when we live the seasons and the moments and the movements of life only depending on what we can do to make things better or what we can do to make ourselves better, we are living as if God is not superintending our lives. The pursuit and total consumption and turning the faith in Jesus Christ into a project to make yourselves more righteous, to make yourselves more holy, is a pursuit that you will be taking on your own. You will be alone in that. I have never in my whole life, I have never seen a person or a group that had turned the faith of Jesus Christ into a project for personal holiness, I've never seen people like that who were not scared, self-righteous, involved with an authoritarian leader, and condescending to those around them. And almost always give those folks enough time, and they have major stumble. Rather, as our baptism vow says, will you depend completely upon the grace of God? And if you said, I will, then you will have to wait through the seasons. You will have to be patient through the movements of life for God to work in your life through grace to make you better, to deal with your problems, to deal with your issues. Those who choose love and grace, the giving of grace, the receiving of grace, they become mature. Those who choose mercy and justice and humility and love and just endure and float through the seasons of life and don't make some self-righteous personal holiness project about themselves, rather accept their strengths and weaknesses, their good things, their faults, and cry out for the grace of God to work in their life to help them persevere. I am passionate about this because it ruins lives, and it ruins other people's lives. This consuming desire for personal holiness, it's self-righteousness disguised in faith or religion. There's nothing more to it. But I want you, if you're following me, I will not be an authoritarian. If you're following me, I want you to walk in freedom. Freedom from trying to make yourself better, rather rely on the superintending hand, the grace-filled hand of God in your lives. Why do I take this left turn on this passage? Jesus says, the truth will set you free. The truth will set you free. And I want you to be free. I want your freedom in this year. I will fight for you to be free this year. I will stand and proclaim freedom for the captives. And I do not want you to be captive or held to anything that is disguised in faith and religion, but is nothing more than self-righteousness, bitterness, and sin. So, raise a hand as a toast to freedom, receiving grace, giving grace, doing justice, being humble, giving mercy to all of those around you. And in that, the Lord will make you who you ought to be. Let's raise a hand, a toast to 2021, where you experience freedom because of God's superintending hand through the movements and cycles of what could be, what looks like a meaningless life. God bless.